Have you ever imagined being stuck on a bus in the middle of a blizzard, with no signal, no food, and the temperature dropping too quickly? It sounds like a scene from a movie, but what if this happened to you? Or someone in your family? Stay with me, because what you're about to see now is more real and more touching than it seems. It was supposed to be just a walk. A group of elderly people returning from an excursion full of laughter, stories told in whispers, and even an old radio playing softly in the background. Inside the bus, the atmosphere was light, almost nostalgic. Coats, souvenirs on laps, wrinkled hands pointing to the landscapes through the window. Everything was peaceful, until the sky started to change. First, some snowflakes. Then, clouds so thick that they seemed to turn off the light of the world. The road began to disappear before the driver's eyes. The snow fell thick, heavy, as if trying to bury any sign of civilization. The old bus skidded. A bump, brake, and silence. In the middle of nowhere. It was the biggest snowfall in the last 30 years. Outside, a white desert. Inside, a cold began to penetrate the feet and rise to the bones. The driver, a young man, tried to remain calm, but it was clear. He didn't know what to do. He took out his cell phone. No signal. Tried the radio. Nothing. He looked at the frightened faces and couldn't hide his panic. "I guess we just have to wait," he said. But wait for what? Some elderly people were still trying to play, to lighten the atmosphere. Others looked out the window, searching for hope that didn't exist. Time passed. The laughter disappeared. The cold was increasing. The food, which no one thought they would need, began to run out. And fear. Fear began to appear in their eyes. A silent fear, the worst kind. And it was at that moment that a man, until then silent, looked up. Frank Donovan, 78 years old. White hair, face hardened by time, quiet look. For the others, just another passenger. But what no one knew was that this gentleman had been a reconnaissance scout in the Arctic during the Korean War. He wasn't just an elderly man, he was a survivor, a war veteran. A man who had already faced death and won. While everyone was wondering what to do, Frank just watched. The glass fogged up. The trail of snow covering everything, feet shaking. And then he said something that no one there would ever forget. "If we wait, they'll find our bodies. If we walk, maybe they'll find footprints." At that moment, the silence was transformed. People didn't know if what he said was a warning or an order. But there was something in the tone of his voice, something in the way he looked at the forest outside that made it seem like he had been there before. As if he knew exactly what would come next. And this is where everything starts to change. Because what Frank Donovan did next, and how he led a group of seniors to survive the cruelest storm in decades, will challenge everything you believe about strength, leadership, and the true meaning of being a hero. It doesn't go away. The real story begins now. Frank stood before that ice-locked door, as if he were looking at an old enemy. Outside, the wind was blowing with the force of a bad memory, the kind that burns the skin, even when everything around is frozen. The others, cornered at the back of the bus, looked at him with a mix of hope and fear. No one dared to say anything. He moved slowly. He took a blanket and wrapped it around the hunched shoulders of a lady who was crying softly, shivering from the cold. Then he bent down and helped a man adjust his leg that was beginning to lose sensation. There were no speeches, just actions. With each gesture, he seemed to light a spark of order in the midst of the panic. And that was all they had. The snow continued to fall, as if the sky had given up on light. The minutes turned into hours, and despair began to change shape. Some tried to pray, others spoke to loved ones as if they could hear, even without signal. A lady held her unconscious sister's hand, whispering, "Wake up, please. Not now, not like this." And Frank there, wrapped in silence, watching. His wrinkled face, exposed to the biting cold, seemed to already know what was coming. He took off his coat and tore it into strips to seal off the gaps in the bus. He organized the internal space to warm the most fragile in the center. He distributed what little food was left without touching anything for himself. The cold was the same for everyone, but he knew he had something different. The memory of what it was like to fight for your life. If you've made it this far, perhaps this story has touched you in some way. Perhaps you have already felt the weight of abandonment, of fear, of the cutting silence of a situation that seemed to have no way out. Or maybe you know someone like Frank, someone who lives in silence but carries invisible battles inside. If this is your case, leave it here in the comments, even if it's just one sentence. Sometimes sharing what we feel is the most beautiful way to honor the stories that can no longer be told. And if this type of story makes you reflect, move, reconnect with what really matters, then enjoy this video. This shows that you want to see more content like this, real, intense, human. And subscribe to the channel, because your presence here is what keeps that flame burning. Every like, every comment, every new subscription is what allows us to continue rescuing these stories that could be forgotten, but don't deserve to be. Frank was still standing. The wind whistled like a warning, but he didn't back down. Time was against them. The white forest in front of the bus seemed impassable. But he took a step, then another, and without saying anything, just with a look, he called the others to follow him. That's how it started. The first dawn was cruel. There was no longer any heat on the bus seats, nor on the body of almost anyone there. The metal structure froze inside, and with each breath, clouds of vapor marked the air, as if even the breath was trying to escape the situation. The cold was no longer a sensation. It was a constant, sharp pain that entered through the nails, through the bones, through the memories. The improvised blankets were no longer enough. A man with thick glasses began to shake uncontrollably. His teeth were chattering so violently that he bit his own tongue without realizing it. Next to him, a small lady with a small face and dull eyes simply stopped responding. Frank came closer, touched her neck. She was still alive, but her skin was almost ice. Someone shouted from the background, "She's dying!" And it was at that moment that the panic stopped being silent. Some tried to open the door by force. Others wanted to run in any direction. "It's better to die trying than to freeze waiting," shouted a man, his fingers already blackened by the cold. But as he pushed the door open, the wind blew snow inside as if to remind everyone who was in control. The cold swept the bus aisle violently. That wasn't just nature. It was a test. The driver, young and inexperienced, tried to maintain some order, but his face was red with despair. He was crying softly, with his head resting on the steering wheel. He was shaking, not from the cold, but from guilt. He whispered disjointed words about his mother, about God, about not having prepared himself enough. Frank looked at him once. Just one. And the boy seemed to understand, in silence, that command had changed hands. It was then that the prayers began. Some in low voices, others in despair. A woman pulled an old rosary out of her pocket and began to pray in Spanish. A man recited psalms with his eyes closed. It was beautiful and devastating at the same time. It wasn't faith. She was fired. Frank watched everything, motionless, every face, every gesture. His silence was different. It wasn't fear. It was calculation. He knew what the cold did to the mind. I knew that soon, the hallucinations, the confusion, the requests to lie down and just rest a little would come. The sleep that comes before death from hypothermia. He had seen it before, on the faces of young soldiers who slept in the snow believing they would wake up. And then he stood up, slowly, no rush, as if he had finally accepted what he needed to do. He walked to the bus door. Nobody had the courage to stop him. He looked outside. The white forest was a living, icy, deadly wall. Still, he didn't hesitate, and it was at that moment that his voice cut the air like a knife. If we wait, they'll find our bodies. If we walk, maybe they'll find footprints. The sentence fell like a stone into an icy lake. Nobody responded. Not a sound. Just the sound of the wind trying to erase any trace of courage. But there was something in the way Frank said it. A tone of someone who already knew death, and therefore knew where it waited. He turned to the group. Frank's eyes didn't ask for permission. They asked for decision. And, little by little, without anyone saying anything, the chaos turned to silence. Desperation became listening, and fear became a seed of movement. This moment was not a miracle. There was no triumphal music. No one shouted, "Let's go!" What happened there was transformation. An invisible change that only happens when someone, even in silence, reminds us of what we are capable of. Comment there. Courage lives in silence. I want to know if this part of the story spoke to you in some way, and there is something important that still needs to be told. Because what this group experienced after they took their first step into the snow is the kind of hidden truth that only those who have been on the brink of surrender will understand. That's why we need to continue this journey. The first step off the bus was like breaking an invisible line between hope and despair. The snow gave way underfoot, sinking to the knees. The cold bit the bones like invisible blades, and the wind, now without the barrier of bodywork, seemed to take the breath away with each gust. Still, they started walking. One by one. Not out of courage, but because there was no longer a choice. Frank wasted no time. He tore up the seats of the bus, and with his calloused hands, he assembled 2 improvised sleds. Tied with belts and cables loose from the trunk, he would use them to carry the weakest. The 2 most weakened women were placed on the snow-swept seats, wrapped in what remained of the blankets. Around them, the other elderly people formed a human circle. It was an instinctive, defensive formation. And in the center, life. Nobody said much. The sound was the crunch of sinking footsteps, the grunts of effort, and, every now and then, a muffled cry. The forest looked like a frozen maze, with branches covered in a thick layer of ice and bare trees that bent under the weight of the blizzard. The daylight was weak, bluish, as if time itself had been trapped in that infinite morning. Hands froze quickly. Faces were starting to crack. One of the men's nose was bleeding, and no one had a tissue, just damp cloths and the strength to continue. The decisions Frank made didn't come from a manual. They came from memory, from the instinct of someone who had already guided soldiers through even more hostile lands. And even with his aging body, there was something in his posture that conveyed direction. As they crossed the first section of the woods, they came across a frozen stream. The ice crust seemed thick, but Frank knew. A crack there could be fatal. He bent down, slammed the makeshift wooden bat hard into the ice, and waited. A snap, small but audible. He diverted the route. He took the group to a wider point, where the banks were covered with hardened snow. There the crossing was slow, tense but safe. Some slipped. One of them fell to his knees and had to be pulled by his arms, with tears in his eyes and purple hands. It was difficult to maintain a firm mindset. The fear of falling and not being able to get up was real. Nobody had any energy left. And then came the howls. In the distance at first, then closer. 3, 4, many. The sound of wolves cut through the silence with surgical precision. The icy forest, which was already inhospitable, now gained hidden eyes. They were being watched. Frank stopped. He raised the baton, and he turned, facing the twisted branches that danced in the wind. He didn't say anything, just looked. The group understood. It was necessary to continue, but with caution. Further on, the howling stopped. The sound that remained was that of heavy breathing, the friction of sleds on the snow, the beating of hearts. A woman asked to stop. He said he couldn't take it anymore. He wanted to lie down. Just a minute, please. Frank knelt down beside her, held her hand, and said firmly, "If you lie down now, you'll never get up again. I've seen that. You're going with me, even if I carry you." And that's what he did. She cried as he lifted her onto his shoulders. Her body was too light, not a good sign. But he didn't waver. It continued. The group followed. Exhausted, hungry, at the limit. The hidden truth about this journey wasn't just the cold or the wolves. It was doubt. The thought that whispered in everyone's mind, what if we don't arrive? What if he's wrong? But no one said, because Frank walked. And as long as he walked, there was a path. Darkness began to fall. And with it, the fear that the night could be the end. But there, in the distance, a different shadow appeared. A barn. Abandoned. Covered in snow, but still standing. It was an old structure, made of cracked wood, but it seemed solid enough. Frank was the first to arrive. He hit the walls with the bat, assessed the ceiling. He entered with the care of a soldier. It was empty and cold, but it was shelter. They entered, one by one. They lay on the damp wooden floor as if they had arrived in paradise. Some cried, others fainted. Frank remained standing, looking at the details, looking for cracks, crevices, anything that could be used. He gathered what little wood he found in a corner and began to build something that no one believed possible. A fire. There was no lighter, not even dry matches, just a knife and an old quartz stone attached to his keychain. He scraped and scraped until a spark appeared, and then another. Time seemed to stop. Nobody spoke. Everyone watched. When the first flame was born, timid, trembling, there was a silence that said it all. They were alive. Right there. I felt the cold here. I want to know if this journey gave you goosebumps too. And even with the fire lit, even with everyone sheltering in that barn, there was still something that no one expected to experience that night. Because Frank Donovan's greatest battle was yet to begin. The fire burned weakly in the center of the barn, but that timid light was enough to rekindle in the group's eyes something that had almost disappeared. The idea that they could still survive. Bodies stretched out in improvised corners, breathing slowly, as if each breath was a miracle. The heat was minimal, but the difference between freezing and living is sometimes 2 degrees and a spark of faith. Frank, however, did not rest. His knees hurt like they were made of cracked glass. Every step inside the shelter creaked. His hands, bandaged in torn pieces of cloth and covered in dry ice, barely held the knife. The fingers were stiff, almost colorless. Still, he continued gathering wood chips, stacking damp sticks, blowing the fire with almost supernatural patience. The kind of patience that only those who have lost a brother in uniform at their side, in silence, learn to cultivate. It was that morning that she collapsed. The lady Frank had carried most of the way. She huddled in a dark corner, her eyes closed, her breathing hitching. He approached slowly, knelt beside her, pressed her cold hand to his chest. She opened her eyes with effort and whispered, "I won't make it. I've already given everything." But Frank, in a firm voice, replied, "You gave everything, and now you're going to get what you still have." He placed the blanket that was her only shelter over her. And he stayed there, in silence, until he saw his eyes close, not from death, but from sleep. The group had crossed the body limit. It was no longer about physical resistance. That was now soul, willing. It was an invisible transformation happening inside. When pain becomes part of the journey, no longer an obstacle. When suffering stops being the end, and becomes the path. But the cold gave no respite. Outside, the wind whistled like a lurking predator. For 3 days, there was no sign of rescue. No voices, no engine noises, just the sound of empty stomachs and shaking joints. The food, which was little, ran out. They began to divide dry leaves mixed with warm water. Each morning, Frank made rounds, counted heads, tested vital signs. I knew that every day was a battle, and every night a minefield of uncertainty. On one of these rounds, he found one of the men sitting outside the barn, without a coat, eyes lost in the stark white. It was delirium. The cold had already begun to swallow his mind. Frank ran, covered his body with whatever he could find, shook his face with his bare hands, shouted with the authority of a war commander, "You're going to get up! Now!" The man cried, "Leave me! It's over!" And Frank, with tears freezing on his face, replied, "For you, maybe it is. But for those who are waiting for you, it's not over yet." And it was there, in that second, that the veteran realized. It wasn't just the snow, nor the wolves, nor the cold. The real enemy was forgetfulness. That feeling that no one would come, that there was no longer any value in fighting. And so, he continued, not just for survival, but to prove that courage still existed. That right at the end of the line, there was something standing. On the third day, during the night, the fire went out. Not because of a lack of wood, but because of tiredness. Frank could no longer keep vigil. He fell to the floor with his face towards the ceiling. He was breathing heavily. His lips were split. His hands were swollen and purple. And yet, when he heard one of the women groan in pain, he crawled over to her. He pushed some straw with his forearm to warm his feet. He slept next to her, like a silent guard. The next morning he was the last to move. He woke up to the distant sound of something different. It wasn't the wind, not even steps. It was a roar of an engine, a muffled sound coming from the east. One of the men crawled to the barn's opening and shouted, "Frank, someone's coming!" But Frank didn't respond immediately. He sat down, closed his eyes, and for the first time, he cried. Not out of weakness, but because he knew what it meant. The mission had been accomplished. Right there. This journey touched me. I want to know if you also felt the weight and beauty hidden on this path. And there's still a part of this story that few people know. And that changed everything when the firefighters finally entered that frozen barn. It's about what they saw and what they heard. When firefighters finally managed to fight their way into the barn, the image they found looked more like a war scene than a rescue. The old wooden shelter, partially covered by snow, exuded a thick smell of cold smoke, dry sweat, and survival. The first rescuer who came through the door stopped instinctively and held back crying. Inside, spread out on the damp wooden floor and covered with improvised straw, were all the elderly people. Alive. Some slept like exhausted children. Others kept their eyes open just to confirm that it was real. But it was what was in the center of the barn that paralyzed everyone. Frank Donovan, kneeling, supported on his knees, his purple hands still close to the fire. He didn't sleep. It was silent. A silence so profound that it made the slow crackling of firewood seem like a scream. One of the firefighters knelt down and gently touched his shoulder. Frank turned his face slowly, his eyes red and sunken. I didn't say anything. He just nodded at the lady next to him, who was still sleeping covered with his blanket. Then he raised his eyes to the ceiling as if to say thanks, and only then fell back, completely passed out. The paramedics rushed over. They tested their signals. He was alive, but dehydrated, in a state of advanced hypothermia, with 2 possibly fractured ribs. However, when they placed him on the stretcher, he grabbed the rescuer's arm and murmured, "Is everyone here?" The man nodded with teary eyes. Frank closed his eyes and finally rested. Outside, the sky was still grey, but now the human presence seemed to rekindle the world. Helicopters approached, nurses came down with thermal blankets, and as strange as it seemed, no one wanted to leave before Frank. He would be the last to leave the barn, and that said a lot. On the way to the hospital, the team discovered details that had been hidden in the midst of the suffering. One of the elderly revealed that Frank not only guided the group, but also provided his share of food for 2 days. That, during the walk, even with his hands freezing, he held the wrists of those who were fainting to prevent them from collapsing alone in the snow, who softly sang old songs to calm those who panicked. There was no arrogance, no speeches, just presence. And perhaps this is precisely what differentiates a true leader. Not the one who speaks the loudest, but the one who remains standing when everyone else is falling. This is the hidden truth that most do not see, and that this episode revealed with brutal beauty. At the hospital, recovery was slow. Frank lost some of the sensitivity in his fingers, had frostbite on his legs, and a respiratory infection that almost took his lungs. But he didn't complain. He just said that he had felt worse, and that the head can handle it. The body will go along with it. Months later, when everyone was recovered, the local city hall organized a ceremony. They wanted to honor the survivors, and of course, the man who saved them. Frank attended with a cane, wearing a simple jacket, the same one he wore to church on Sundays. When he stood on the small stage of the municipal school, facing a packed audience, he did not hold a microphone. He just looked everyone in the eye and said, "War teaches a lot. But what made me cross that forest was remembering that one day someone crossed for me." Silence. Then applause. Standing ovation. Applause with tears, with gratitude, ashamed that they never asked what Frank did before he retired. Because it's often like this. The most incredible heroes walk among us with silent steps and eyes that have seen too much. And only when the world collapses do we realize what they carry inside. Right there, I believe in real heroes. Because stories like this aren't just about moving people. They are to remind us that, even in the darkest moments, there is a flame that just needs a spark to light. The story spread like wildfire. At first, it was just a footnote in the local news. Group of elderly people rescued after being trapped in historic blizzard. But it was enough for someone to mention the name of the man who guided them through the frozen forest for the narrative to take on a different tone. It was no longer about an excursion gone wrong. It was about an impossible rescue. It was about a veteran who returned to war. Only this time, the enemy was time, cold and oblivion. Social media exploded. Someone posted a photo of Frank being carried on a stretcher, his face swollen from the cold, but with an almost imperceptible smile at the corner of his mouth. The caption said, "The Silent Hero." In less than 24 hours, thousands of people were commenting, sharing, crying. Unknown faces wrote messages as if speaking to an old friend. "You remind me of my grandfather. It made me rethink my life. This man saved more than lives. He saved our faith in humanity." And while the world reacted outside, Frank remained in the hospital, lying in silence, connected to tubes, watching the ceiling with that same steady gaze as always. He didn't seem to be impressed by the commotion. It wasn't pride. It was a rare kind of humility, the kind that comes from someone who has seen the worst and, therefore, is not dazzled by applause. The medical team said he needed absolute rest. But on the third night, a nurse found Frank standing facing the window. I was shaking, yes, but it was there, in silence, watching the snow fall outside. As she approached, he whispered, "It's weird. I've spent days running away from it. And now I can't stop looking." The nurse asked if he wanted her to close the curtain. He replied, "No, I just need to remember." This phrase kept echoing behind the scenes in the recovery ward, because no one really understood what he needed to remember. But you only had to look into his eyes to know that there was something inside there, a piece of the past that was never lost, a piece that somehow was the silent fuel behind every decision he made in the forest. And it was in this climate of curiosity that the letter emerged. It was found, by chance, in a brown envelope hidden among his things, inside the old backpack he always carried, the same one he used during his crossing days. Nobody knew about the existence of that letter. It was addressed to a name scrawled in shaky handwriting, Sergeant Holloway. The hospital staff didn't recognize the name, but when the contents were read, the revelation was like a punch in the gut. It was a letter written 42 years earlier. "If I freeze to death on this mission, at least I'll know someone stayed alive because I stayed upright. Don't let me forget why we're here. Don't let me fall inside, even if my body gives out. Pull me back, Holloway. Remind me of who I was, if I ever forget." The lyrics were by Frank, addressed to a fellow soldier who died in his arms, buried in the Arctic snow. A brother in uniform that he couldn't save. A ghost that had somehow stayed with him all those years. A piece of pain that became a compass, which became purpose. That explained everything. The reason behind the silence. The insistence on carrying a lady on your shoulders. The refusal to be the first to leave the barn. The ability to walk for hours with bleeding feet. Frank wasn't just saving lives. He was mending an old wound, fulfilling a promise that no one else remembered, but that still burned for him as if it were yesterday. This is the layer that few see in real life. The truth hidden behind the bravery. Unresolved pain that turns into strength. It wasn't just the war that marked Frank. These were decisions that were not forgotten. The undigested losses. The names recorded in silence, like prayers stuck in the chest. And even when the press began offering interviews, invitations to television programs, public tributes, Frank refused most of them. He only accepted one meeting with the survivors. No audience, no photographers. In a modest community room with simple cake and lukewarm coffee. There, alongside those walking beside him in the snow, he smiled for the first time. Not a smile of glory, but peace. Right there. I understand the weight of silence. Because sometimes what transforms a journey most is not the screams, but what remains quiet. Frank didn't want to go. When he received the school's invitation to share his story with the students, he just looked at the paper, folded it carefully, and put it in his pocket without saying a word. Not because I thought it was unnecessary, but because it still hurt. Talking about all that, reliving every step in the snow, every groan muffled by the cold, every look from someone who had already given up. It was like opening wounds that had healed on the outside, but continued to bleed on the inside. It was the survivors themselves who convinced him. One by one, they told him this wasn't about vanity. It was about legacy. It was about planting in other hearts what he had carried on his shoulders, the responsibility of not abandoning anyone. And when the granddaughter of one of the rescued ladies wrote a letter by hand saying, "If you can inspire my brother to be as brave as you, I'm already happy," he sighed and accepted. On the morning of the visit, he put on the simplest clothes he had. He didn't wear medals, no badges, just a grey coat and a worn felt hat that he had kept since his army days. He arrived walking slowly, with his cane tapping on the floor, like a metronome of memories. The school received him in silence. It was as if everyone knew that this man carried something greater than words. When he entered the auditorium, the children stood up without anyone telling them to. One by one, the little ones stood up. Most of them didn't even really understand what he had done. But they knew there was someone different here. Someone who went through the impossible and came back alive to tell the story. Frank didn't use a microphone. He just sat down on a simple wooden chair, looked at the children and began, "I didn't come to tell you a story about myself. I came to remind you of what still exists inside each of you." And with a hoarse, slow voice, he described the crossing. But not the way the newspapers told it. He spoke of the details that no one sees, the hunger that transforms the sound of the stomach into a lament of the soul, the fear that enters through the cracks in faith, and the silence of those who decide to continue, even when they are not sure if they will succeed. As he spoke, some children cried softly. Teachers, too. There was an aching purity in those words. A type of truth that has no place in speeches or headlines. It was a raw revelation. It was behind the pain. But the moment no one has forgotten was when a child raised his hand and asked, "Aren't you mad at anyone, Mr. Frank, for being left out there in the snow?" The auditorium fell silent. Frank looked down. He took a deep breath. Then he slowly raised his head and replied, "We only carry what we decide not to let go of. I decided not to carry anger. I carried people. And that's what saved me." This phrase became a mural at school. They were printed on t-shirts. They painted on a wall. But more than that, it was recorded in those who heard it. Because there, on that day, a new mentality was born. That courage is not just for epic moments. Courage is also when you choose not to take revenge, not to hide, not to forget those who still need you. After the talk, Frank walked down the steps with difficulty. I was tired, sweaty. And even so, he stopped to hug each child who came to him. A long line where each gesture was more than just a thank you. It was a seed of transformation. But what no one knew, and which would only come to light days later, was that that speech had been planned with a hidden intention. Frank already knew that his health was hanging by a thread. I didn't want to tell anyone, not out of fear, but because I wanted the legacy to speak louder than the farewell. The following week, when visiting the grave of his old companion Holloway, he took with him not just flowers, but the children of the survivors. It took children, teenagers, and even a young wheelchair user who had lost his parents early and was inspired by his story to continue studying. Everyone was silent, standing in front of a cold tombstone, while Frank knelt with difficulty. And it was there, without any official ceremony, without any camera, that he did something that no one expected. He took the old letter out of his pocket and read it out loud. Every word of the letter he had written more than 4 decades earlier was now heard by new generations. It was more than a tribute. It was a reunion. It was a liberation. And when he finished reading, Frank just said, "Mission accomplished, Sergeant." Then he stood up with help, looked around, and smiled as if he had finally left the weight of war there, in that sacred land. Right there. I also carry someone with me. Because sometimes it's not the ghosts that haunt us. It's the promises that still move us. If you've made it this far, it's because something inside you connected with this story. Maybe I remembered someone. Maybe he saw each other at some point. Or maybe I just felt like there were still people and stories that were really worth telling. This is the type of content that I want to continue bringing here. Stories that touch, that inspire, that bring back something that we, sometimes, didn't even know we had lost. So, if this made sense to you, if this story moved you, or made you reflect, subscribe to the channel. Because here, we will continue to tell you what the world forgot. Leave a comment saying, "I walked with Frank until the end," just so I know that you are here, step by step, along with me on this journey. And if at any point this video moved you, leave a like. It helps show YouTube that these types of stories still matter, which is worth telling, and listening to. There is a video here that complements all of this. Click and stay with me there. The next story is already waiting for you.